Hello, this lesson will be on public opinion polling and how it is used by politicians and the media. This lesson will cover learning targets 1 through 4. Learning target number 1 is students will be able to define polling, universe, as it applies to polling, random sample, margin of error, push poll, and representative sample. Learning target number 2, students will be able to calculate the margin of error of a poll. Learning target number 3, students will be able to identify common problems with polling. Learning target number 4, students will be able to compare and contrast the way the media uses polling and the way that political campaigns use polling. Have you ever been walking through the mall and someone asks you if you'd like money for telling them what you thought about a product? Have you ever had a pop-up on a website or an app that asks you to rate that website or app? Has a store ever offered a discount to you if you go online and tell them about your experience at that store? These are all forms of polling. The media and politicians use polling all the time to gauge what voters are thinking. Public opinion polling is a way to learn what the public is thinking about a particular issue. It is a measure of public opinion, often conducted by mail, telephone, or online surveys. Here is an example of polling. The Columbus Dispatch wanted to know what people thought the last time Ohio raised the minimum wage. The Dispatch asked the question, "What do you think about the increase in the minimum wage?" The paper gave the respondents 3 choices. The first choice was, "Okay, but it could be higher." 40% of the people liked this response. The second response, "The minimum wage is too high already," got 27%. The third response, "It will be a good improvement," got 33%. Is this an accurate poll? Do you think the poll was a good measure of what the people of Central Ohio were thinking? Is this poll missing any vital information? Think about that for a moment. We'll come back to this poll. There are some terms that we need to define that have to do with polling. The first one is universe. No, not that universe. In our case, the universe is a group of people being studied. For example, if you were polling people who they would vote for in the governor's race, the universe would be all registered voters in the state of Ohio. For your project, since you are seeing how to influence your fellow students, your universe will be all the students of the school. Representative sample. You cannot ask every person in the universe your polling question. What you want is a group of people that represent the universe. For example, a city wants to know if they should put up a mall by a particular neighborhood. It surveys the entire city. The city would have to get a mix of people. They need homeowners, business owners, men, women, people that live near the proposed site, and people who do not. If they only survey men who live near the proposed site, do they have a representative sample? For your project, what is your representative sample going to look like? It's going to have to be both men and women, freshmen, sophomore, juniors, and seniors in equal proportions. One or more of your poll questions will have to be a demographic question so that you know if you have a true representative sample. As you may have guessed already, polling is very scientific. There are fields of math dedicated to polling and statistics. There are some important technical issues that make polls scientific. The first of these is random sampling. There needs to be an equal chance that everyone in the universe is going to be sampled. If you are conducting a poll, one way to make sure the sample is random is to open the phone book and call every 5th person. For our project, one way to get a random sample is to go to the lunchroom, start at one end, and poll the person in every 5th seat. The other technical term that you need to be familiar with is margin of error. Margin of error is the measure of how much the sample size results are likely to differ from the universe. The larger the sample size, the lower the margin of error. Margin of error is figured out by this mathematical formula, with n being the number of people surveyed. Most polls ask 1,000 to 1,300 people for an accurate margin of error. The margin of error for 1,300 people is plus or minus 3%. The more people from the universe polled, the more accurate the poll. Let's go back to our dispatch poll. Let's assume that the margin of error for the poll is plus or minus 3%. You had 44% of the people respond that the minimum wage should be higher. With a margin of error of plus or minus 3%, what that means is that if you were to poll the entire universe, the real number would be between 47% and 41%. How do we use polling in politics? The media uses polling to predict the future, report election trends, gauge the popularity of politicians and ideas. The media likes reporting the horse race. They like to show who is up and who is dropping. Politicians also like to poll to know where they are in the race, but they use polling for other reasons as well. They need to know what issues are important to potential voters. They need to know what is going to get those voters to the polls. Politicians also use polling to test messages. A phrase, change you can believe in, was tested before it ever was used in a campaign ad or a speech. For your project, you want to have demographic questions, questions to see what the electorate thinks, and questions that test potential campaign messages. Not all political polling is above board. There are polls that are not intended to gather information, but to spread disinformation. This is called push polling. Push polling is a poll in which an individual or an organization attempts to influence or alter the view of voters under the guise of conducting a poll. In the year 2000, in South Carolina, before the Republican primary, pollsters called white voters and asked the question, would you be more likely or less likely to vote for John McCain if you knew that he had fathered an illegitimate black child? The result of this push polling was bad for John McCain. He went from being the favorite to an also-ran in the state of South Carolina, a very important Republican primary. There are some common problems that may skew the result of any poll. The first one is that the sample size is too small. The smaller the sample size, the larger the margin of error. If you have a large margin of error, you can't rely and you can't really be sure on what the polling is telling you. Another problem is that the sample is not typical of the universe. Here's an example. An election has a provision that deals with women's reproductive health. If a poll is conducted and the only people that are asked are white, upper-class male Catholics, then what has the poll told you about the universe as a whole? Still another problem. If you do not word your survey questions clearly, the person taking the poll will have a hard time answering the questions. Survey questions have to be clear and to the point. You cannot let the respondent interpret what you are trying to say. If your survey questions are biased or leading, then you are only going to get affirmation and not opinion. If you ask who you like better, Senator Smith, who took money from a cigarette lobby, or Councilman Jones, who loves puppies, the question is biased. People are obviously going to go with the person that loves puppies. People love puppies. They don't love cigarettes. Another problem may have nothing to do with the questions, but with the respondents. If the pollster is asking people that don't know anything about the issue, then they are going to get unreliable results. For example, if a pollster came to your classroom and asked you about the mayor's race in Toronto, who would you vote for? Would you know how to answer? When you write your poll questions, give people an out. Do you like candidate A? Do you like candidate B? Or do you have no opinion? All three answers tell you something. If they pick a candidate, you know who is running. You know who is winning. If they pick no opinion, then you know you have to educate the public about your candidate or issue. The final common problem is the data collected has been interpreted incorrectly. If a poll says candidate A is getting 10% of the vote, and candidate B is getting 40% of the vote, and the undecided gets 50% of the vote, if candidate B looks at that and thinks that they're winning, they have not interpreted the poll correctly. With the margin of error and the undecided, it could be a landslide victory for candidate A. Some tips for your polls. First, make sure you have the questions that you need. You need demographic questions, you need opinion questions, and you need questions that test potential messages. 10 to 15 questions should be enough to get your project done. Some of those demographic questions you can answer for the respondent. You can tell what sex they are without asking them. Another tip is to make sure your questions are close-ended. You don't want them thinking up an answer to your questions other than the options that you gave them. Don't do your polls in study halls or classrooms. It will skew your demographics. Study halls are full of underclassmen who will be overrepresented in your poll. Classrooms are full of people that are there for the same reason. It's not very random. The best place to conduct your polls is in the lunchroom and in the entrance to the school before it starts every morning. Remember, the idea is to randomly pick people. every fifth person through the door. You're going to have to talk to people you don't know. You are going to have a huge margin of error. Be careful when you interpret your data. Account for the margin of error. Get as many respondents as you can to drive down the margin of error. The minimum is 100, but if you can get more than that, then do it.
Thank you for listening to this lesson. Now go write a good poll.